Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Laugesen, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Please subscribe to our Substack at Present Danger China and follow us on X at CPD China. Our moderator is Frank Gaffney. Frank is president of the Institute for the American Future, vice chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America on Real America's Voice Network.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of our webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger China. We have done, I think, over 200 of these now, and they are meant to help illuminate the truly mind-boggling comprehensiveness of the war that has been waged against this country by the Chinese Communist Party for decades. These programs are made all the more urgently needed because so few of us understand we're even in the Chinese crosshairs, let alone under this kind of sustained and truly debilitating assault. The topic of today's program is perhaps one of the most incredible of all of the examples of what the Chinese have done to us and what they've accomplished by so doing. It begins with one of the most incredible examples of the warfare they've waged against us, namely that has demonstrably served to take down so much of America's industrial base and capabilities, creating conditions under which it is now the Chinese who supply much of what America needs, both for its economic well-being, for the quality of life of its people, in some cases actually for our lives themselves. We're going to talk about all of this in the context of an aspect of this untenable dependency on the Chinese Communist Party, in one of the places where it is most frightening and dangerous, namely that even our military is reliant upon sources of supply from China, involving equipment, or at least components thereof, materials of various kinds, even the minerals from which such materials are manufactured. We're going to have several extraordinary presentations in the course of this program aimed at exposing how we got into this fix, who is responsible for it, why it is that so little has been done about it, and what the stakes are that we have, even in our Defense Department and its industrial base here in the United States, such as it is. The sorts of reliance on critical supply chains that the Chinese Communist Party can, and in some cases actually has, cut off at will. We're going to begin with one of our favorite contributors to these programs. His name is Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired. For those of you who have not seen him previously, just the quickest of sort of his background updates. He has not only served, of course, in the Marines, rising to the rank of a full colonel, but also as a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. He was a defense attaché there. He has been a businessman in East Asia, notably with a formerly very prominent American company known as Motorola. He will be speaking to us about, among other things, insights that he gleaned from his time at Motorola and doing business more generally in East Asia. On the topic of the CCP's targeting of America's industrial base, how we became dependent on Chinese supply chains. Colonel Newsham is also the author of a very relevant book, When China Attacks, and we're delighted to have him with us in person in the very dark of the night, his time. Colonel, thank you so much for being awake and joining us once again. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Frank. Glad to be here. I'll just jump right in. It's useful to know a little bit of history to understand how we got into the fix we're in now. And it's not exactly ancient history. If you remember back in the 1980s, for example, you could go into a Walmart store and everything was made in America. In fact, Walmart actually had used this as a marketing tool, so pointing out, we're from Bentonville, Arkansas, and our products are made in America. And then you go into a Walmart today and everything is made in China. Nothing is made in America. So it's not exactly ancient history. It's maybe 35 years ago that this happened to us. As you mentioned, I used to work for Motorola, and listening to our stories gives you a little more understanding of exactly what happened. Motorola went into China really in force right after Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989 or so. And Motorola was in fact the anchor tenant for this move by American business to set up in America, with the idea being if you make China wealthier, it'll become a more responsible country, it'll liberalize, it will become like a really giant Canada. And that was the idea. And Motorola went in with full encouragement of the US government and with this idea to transform the PRC. Now, Motorola's thinking was, well, the government said it's okay. And they also thought, well, the Chinese will just be happy to have jobs with a good company, and they will sort of make the stuff that we tell them to make, and they'll keep buying it, and we will just get richer and richer. Well, what the Chinese were doing, and you knew it at the time, was that they were going to figure out how Motorola made things, make their own, rival companies, and offer it at a lower price, take up market share, and eventually put Motorola out of business. That was the idea. And Motorola didn't do anywhere near enough to protect itself. It handed over a lot of technology. What it didn't, most of it you had to expect was stolen. And as a result, 15 years later, Motorola almost didn't exist. And what it did exist is now pretty much Chinese owned. That's how bad it was. But why did we do this? Well, the thinking was, well, Motorola is a huge market. And the Chinese can't innovate, and there's always been a sense of condescension towards the Chinese that, well, they just can't innovate, and we'll make the stuff, we have the ideas, and then we'll just have these people put it together. There was a sense they will never be our equals. And I remember around this time, the head of one of the Hughes Electronics groups actually said he didn't mind giving technology to the Chinese because they would never be up to Hughes standards. I also attended a meeting once in the U.S. Embassy with the commercial minister to talk to a visiting retired U.S. Marine general, a very well-respected guy, who came in, and he was helping an American company help the Chinese develop their rocket launch capabilities. And he was insisting there was no threat from the Chinese. And Motorola, I later learned, actually was helping the Chinese develop MIRV technology, which means you can shoot up one missile and send out a number of rockets from that, weapons from that. And we had our role in that. There really was a sense that, well, there's no military threat from the Chinese. And if you raise this question, I remember it, you'd be told you were stupid, et cetera, et cetera. There was also a thinking, well, we're going to be nice to the Chinese because they will get farther away from the Russians. Well, that didn't exactly work either. But around 2000, little after, when China got into the World Trade Organization, that just supercharged everything. And then you saw this mass rush of US companies to move their operations, particularly their manufacturing operations, to China. And a lot of companies, especially the smaller ones, just sold out to the Chinese. There was a sense that, well, I'll get my chunk of cash, and if there's any problems, well, I'll be sitting on the beach somewhere. And this was the common thinking at the time. Also, if you'd moved your manufacturing to China, well, there were no environmental regulations, there were no unions to deal with, and it all cost a fraction of whatever. No thought at all for the people who were being sort of displaced and effectively killed in the United States by taking away their jobs. But now to the military part of all of this. It's also important to remember that the military, in the US military, you couldn't even say China was a threat. You couldn't even use the word adversary until about 2017. And you know who came along in 2017? It was the first Trump administration. Before that, if you did say that, you were in trouble. The worst case that I know of was Captain James Fennell, the former head of intelligence at Pacific Fleet, said around 2013-14 that China was looking and getting ready for a short, sharp war. I'm told the White House was incensed. They demanded his head. The commander out in Hawaii, Harry Harris, handed it over. Just supine act of cowardice. But that's how bad it was. I got in trouble on occasion from Marine Corps commissars from saying that China was a threat we had to get ready. We had to get ready for. Remember, you'd hear the words, "Well, America doesn't face a peer adversary," and we ignored the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, the nature of that regime, and that's been going on from the beginning of this 35-year, 40-year period of when we have gotten in bed with the Chinese and sent so much of our business over to China, so much of our manufacturing. And there was very much a sense, and I remember you would hear this from the CEO, CFO, MBA class that you'd run into at our company. And I later saw it with a Wall Street firm. There was a sense that people who manufacture things, they're just assemblers. They're pretty much losers. It's the people who develop the intellectual property, license it out, and then have their basically these ants put it together. It's the people who who develop the stuff. They're the real important ones. And the Chinese just must have been laughing, and they looked at all of this very much as just a war front against the United States. Yes, at first when the opening up took place, that the Chinese just wanted to actually have something of an economy after the horror of the Communist Party rule, and that was part of it. But there was always an intention that they were going to displace the United States and build up the Chinese economy, and that means take down the U.S. economy. And that was always the intention. And it wasn't hard to understand even back then. I'll point that out because there were groups in the U.S. government. There was the National Counterintelligence Center, or whatever they called it. They used to send out warnings to companies like Motorola explaining exactly what the Chinese intentions were. Some of us tried to warn, but we weren't all that successful. But this has been known, and there have been people who've sounded the alarm. Back to the military, I would ask, well, which general officer actually said that China was a threat? It'd be a very short list. Robert Willard, once the commander at PACOM, he was on it. But in terms of general officers, very few actually said that we had to be worried about China doing business with China, engaging with China. And now you look at the extent to which China has gotten into our supply chains, to the extent the U.S. military is dependent on things that come from China. And it's almost as if it has been a collective act of suicide. It's this bad. It is horrifying. And I think others will be talking about this. But this is really an example of mass psychosis. People who knew better weren't listened to, ostracized, humiliated, etc. And now it's very late in the day, and we're sort of waking up, but one does hope we get some time. I'm not so sure the PRC is going to cooperate. So that's my bit. And as I said, it's worth knowing that a little history here, and also realizing that it wasn't that long ago, and that we used to make things, that we got along very well without doing business with the Chinese, and our military did as well. So there's no reason we can't get back to it, assuming that divine providence gives us a break once again. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Colonel. This is incalculably important background because you have explained the otherwise inexplicable. How did we get into this fix? We're going to turn next to a man who has been studying the fix we're in particular with respect to supply chain dependency on the part of the U.S. Defense Department. He has a background in that department, notably as a 10-year veteran of the United States Army, the 82nd Airborne and its 4th Psychological Operations Group. These days, he is the executive director of the Special Operations Association of America. He has been a national security advisor to a member of Congress, prominent one, Darrell Issa. He is also continuing to provide support on open source intelligence capabilities and policy for the U.S. Defense Department. His name is David Cook. He is going to talk with us about how bad is this problem, with some specific cases of how the military of the United States has become dependent on our mortal enemy, the Chinese Communist Party. David, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm David Cook, Executive Director of the Special Operations Association of America. We're a 501c19 veteran service organization, and our advocacy is focused on special operations and the voice of SOF, or Special Operations Forces. Like Frank said, today we're looking at supply chain risk or vulnerabilities that we have specifically in the medical department, and then I'll go over a little bit in the data supply chain or the open source intelligence realm. I won't belabor the point here. Colonel Newsham had a great history there, but 2023, the ODNI threat assessment said China is capable of leveraging its dominant positions in key global supply chains and attempts to accomplish those goals. They conveniently left it out in the 2024 annual threat assessment. But U.S. Navy is getting a little better. Recently, Raytheon CEO said it's not feasible for the U.S. manufacturers to fully decouple from China. They can only de-risk. So whatever that means to him. And then this was recent in January. There are 134 Chinese military companies operating in the U.S., 57 firms and 77 subsidies, everything from Huawei all the way down to some of the third-party biotech companies where Biogen or Amgen will outsource some of their genome testing. This is concerning to me. This is from an individual first aid kit that I sourced from some Army buddies this week. I will say they've been a little better. Some of my old IFACs that were expired, I couldn't find a single medical component in there that was manufactured in the United States. It was all made in China. Sorry, my youngest has a Valentine's Day present for me from school. But this is a compression bandage here. You can see made in China. The tube on the right is a nasal pharyngeal, which if a soldier gets their face blown off or needs an airway opened, you stick that thing deep into their nostril and open the airway. And then there are special mission units who use specialized auto injectors, pre-filled medicine for combat medicine. I don't have a picture of that. I wouldn't share that here, but it's made in China. Some of them are made in China. You can imagine what issues that raises. And why does this matter? It's like Colonel Newsham said, the ants that assemble all these things. Well, we saw one of the greatest supply chain warfare operations maybe ever so far, where Israel operated or stuffed more than 1,200 pagers full of explosives and blew them all up with precision. So if a tiny if Israel can do it, China can certainly do that. So I could pivot real quick to open source intelligence, which is near and dear to my heart. The explosion of more publicly available information every day, which is being used by military and the intelligence community. Shout out to the House Intel Committee, who just stood up a subcommittee on open source intelligence. We all know that physical things in the supply chain are vulnerable. I would say the data is just as vulnerable. We saw the OPM hack in early 2014, where everybody with the security clearance has their data stored somewhere in China, I'm sure, on a server. Here's a company that stood up to offer open source intelligence software. And right there on their website, they've got an address there in China. They offer it to the intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies. I'll give you a better example. One with a No Limits partnership here in Russia. A company called Social Links, which does a lot of business with our European allies, even some US law enforcement. There's a Dun & Bradstreet company record here that was started in Moscow. The business structure and funding goes all the way up to an authorized user or an authorized administrator for President Putin himself. The CEO of the company, his breach data, his banking records were found in breach data for a sanctioned Russian bank. Why does that matter? And how can we apply it to China? The mutually legal assistance treaties of the United States offers over 100 countries that we do business with, or we share intelligence with, between the DOJ and their law enforcement. That software, open source intelligence software, is being used by our partners. We share information and intelligence with them, and that could potentially be compromised. And we've seen it with Russia a lot, and we're starting to see it more and more with China today. And that's it. I'm David Cook, and this is how to get a hold of me if you have questions.
David, thank you. We're so appreciative of your contributions. And what you've just demonstrated is these are not secrets. This is readily available to not least the troops that are using some of this stuff. We'll be talking more about some other aspects of the medical piece of this with one of our colleagues in a moment. But before we do, I wanted to call up another old friend, a colleague who has participated in these programs when he can. He is an incredible resource on a whole host of topics, both to us at the Committee on the Present Danger China, and I'm happy to say to the United States government as well. His name is Ross Kennedy. He is the founder of Fortis Analysis. It's an outfit that specializes in various sectors that are vital to our economic and national security well-being, including agribusiness, chemical, energy, humanitarian food, defense, and water supply chains. His specialty is really logistics, and he is as good at it as anybody I've ever encountered. We've asked Ross to talk a bit about America's vulnerable food supply chains, among others, and whether that constitutes a threat to U.S. national security as well. Ross, welcome back. It's good to have you, my friend. Over to you.
Thank you, Frank. The timing of this is really, really interesting when we take a look at President Trump's day one promise on the inauguration to begin bringing food prices down, to begin bringing fuel prices down, other staple goods in the economy, and that instantly or immediately still is a quarterly or semi-annual type of time frame when you're talking about the very, very complex interdependencies of food supply chain, let alone one that's as globalized as ours. And really specifically in relation to the U.S., two words constantly come to mind to try to quantify the risk of this interdependency or this connectivity. Familiar certainly with the issues that David just spoke about as well, with regard to medical technologies. And one of the interesting things that came to mind was that not only are the components that are in these kits, manufactured in China or in some way undergone a substantial transformation or value added. For example, combat gauze not only is often woven and manufactured in China, but a lot of times it's irradiated there to kill off any bacteria or anything that might have gotten onto it during the manufacturing process, and then it's packaged in packaging that's manufactured in China. There's a lot of reasons for that, but what it shows is that really every step of that process is a potential point of entry for risk to U.S. supply chains, to U.S. consumers, to the entities that purchase these products. And so the word that often comes to mind is omni-domain. We talk about specific domains of risk. We've broken it out here by, manufacturing, by defense articles, by medical goods, by food, but really it's an omni-domain risk because of how tightly interwoven these things have become. And the other word that comes to mind is upstream. When it comes to food, at least, the United States has really been a net exporter to China historically. That dynamic is starting to shift a little bit as China changes its sourcing patterns to reduce its dependence on U.S. commodities, food, feed ingredients. But there is still a lot of upstream risk in terms of food packaging, in terms of chemicals, in terms of parts and components for machines and processing equipment. But we'll run down the list of some of those. But really, those two words, omni-domain and upstream, characterize the broad nature of the threat to U.S. food supply chains. The first thing that really comes to mind is the lack of oversight mechanisms in the food industry relative to defense, dual-use articles, sensitive technologies. We have very robust regulatory and oversight regimes for a lot of things, particularly things that are in the DoD supply chain. We have whole sections of the U.S. code dedicated to what you can and cannot do. We have the Berry Amendment, which is part of the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, that says you can't buy from these countries. You can't source or do business or route shipments through these countries. Those rules are violated pretty repeatedly. I know of several examples specifically just off the top of my head, but that's outside the scope of what we're doing. But there are these regimes and mitigation and oversight authorities that exist, but we don't really have that in the U.S. food and feed supply chain. We don't have it upstream with manufacturing equipment, raw material sourcing, ownership of land, farmland by Chinese entities in the United States. We don't have it downstream, outside of the general guidelines that are issued by the FDA as far as consumer safety. CBP as far as imports and exports. Some very basic guidelines governing food that USDA has and that Commerce has. But there's not really a coherent, targeted approach to mitigating risk from the regulatory side, and China really actively exploits that. I did mention the food processing equipment. It's not just the larger pieces of equipment. The U.S. still manufactures a lot of that. Germany manufactures a lot of it as well. We source heavily from the EU for a lot of these things, but a lot of the parts and components that need to keep these things running when you're doing periodic interval maintenance, those do come from China. And just because the bill of lading says it might have, it's a bearing or a bushel or a fastener that might have come from Taiwan, in all likelihood, it probably didn't when you really begin to dig into the paperwork of the transaction. But that takes a significant amount of man hours and oversight and analytics to be able to detect those irregularities and those violations. You have two-stepping of and then alternative sourcing of food and defense articles through U.S.-friendly countries. We saw an explosion of export activity from Vietnam for a lot of things. Vietnam was an improved country for a great number of things during COVID. But when you really dig into the details, a lot of the investment to set up, the capital expenditures that are required to acquire land, buildings, equipment, the operational expenses to hire personnel and procure raw materials and packaging and ocean freight to be able to get it to the U.S., a lot of that operating capital and investment capital was actually coming from China because there are still friendly relations outside of the South China Sea issue between these two communist governments. I mentioned the control of farmland in the U.S. and was deeply involved and really in a lot of ways kind of the progenitor of awareness of that, starting with the Fufang issue in 2021 in Grand Forks, North Dakota, which was a wet corn mill operation that manufactures food and feed ingredients, particularly amino acids. And so trying to cut through the mess of not only explaining the vulnerability just from the issue of a Chinese de facto state-owned enterprise owning land 12 miles from an Air Force base, particularly Grand Forks, which is far more important than a lot of people realize. Then I had to explain how the introduction of a Chinese-owned company and manufacturing cluster inside the U.S. indigenous supply chain was a risk in a lot of ways. We finally got there, but that really taught me how little there is from the policy side, from an enforcement regulatory side at the local, state, or national level, and awareness there is on these issues. Other issues include industrial espionage. You're talking about all domain there, human, cyber, financial, influence operations, lawfare, IP theft, both within corporations and within the research institutions that do a lot of companion research, particularly at the land grant schools, which are the major agriculture innovation schools in each state, Iowa State, University of Illinois, University of Minnesota. These are federally funded, very large, billions of dollars a year in the aggregate programs at these research institutions, and a good probably third of them are Chinese national students that are working on the research. They pocket it, and then when they go home for Golden Week or Chinese New Year, whenever it may be, they're taking all that research back with them, and there's not adequate controls on that. China is also adept at proxy and gray zone warfare, especially in countries where the Belt and Road Initiative and or China-owned extraction and sourcing operations exist. So that's bauxite in Ghana and Jamaica. That's fishery operations. That's vanadium mines. That's all of these things that tie together. And whereas in the US, we view these as verticalized, siloed issues, China views them as all pieces on the same playing board, and they maneuver entities and dollars and influence around to be able to have as big an impact as possible for their spend. Whereas in the US, we kind of tend to compartmentalize these and address them as specific issues rather than, more the sum of the whole. You have China dominance of global shipping, their support for an operation of shadow fleet vessels. You have Lodging, which is a massive data mining operation that is owned by the Chinese government to collect and aggregate and to use logistics and supply chain data as part of a targeting and disruptive campaign against foreign competitors and supply chain and logistics providers. You have critical mineral supplies, which is a very well-known issue, probably more so than a lot in DC, but that continues to be a pacing issue. So when you talk about all of that, then you begin to drill into the specifics of things that are more related to the food and feed supply chain in the US. You realize that it's the American consumer, the American people, and the Department of Defense, as well as all of the other interagency entities that have exposure to this. And I'll just run down a quick list of some statistics here. Can certainly share those with Frank and the team so that people can know this. Amino acids are a vital piece of the animal protein supply chain in the US. Because we produce so many animals at scale, you have to really dial in their nutrition and their pharmaceutical intake to ensure that these animals stay healthy within the feeding operations and then, throughout their life cycle. 70% of the vitamins in the world are produced in China. The United States produces very, very little indigenously. 77% of a vital amino acid, the largest and most important one, lysine, 77% of that's produced in China as well. That comes out of the wet corn milling process. 37% of the lysine consumed in the last year within the United States animal protein supply chain was sourced from China. 85 to 90% of the next most important amino acid, threonine, in the world is produced in China. We produce very little in the US. Valine and methionine are both very important. Valine is 84% of global productions in China. 27% of the methionine is produced in China. And a lot of the statistics that show that methionine is produced in Singapore is actually China origin stuff that is two-stepped out of China and kind of laundered, if you will, through the Singaporean supply chain before being brought into the US. And that really began when methionine and valine, tribasic copper chloride, a lot of these other ingredients got hit with 25% Section 301 tariffs in the first Trump admin and were enforced throughout COVID. You started to see a lot of this two-stepping activity happen of vitamins and amino acids. The US is almost totally dependent on raw vitamin imports. You get massive animal protein, or for the animals, the feedstock, if you will, that are in the animal protein supply chain. You get massive health issues, production issues. It makes it outbreak of disease a lot easier as well. You have culling of the herds. You have a lot of these issues that happen when they don't have vitamins, and the U.S. produces none of the critical vitamins that are really necessary to keep an animal population healthy up and down the supply chain. On the fertilizer side, for row crop production and food grade produce, you have 25% of all the macronutrients in the world, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK, are produced in China. U.S. imports about 20% of our needs annually across those. Not as much of that is sourced directly from China, but it's a very small group of producers internationally, most of whom China has a lot of influence on. Mexico, Canada, Russia, some in the EU, Peru. Morocco is really kind of an outlier for one of the specific ingredients, so is Saudi Arabia. They tend to more stand on their own, but the U.S. has taken a targeted approach on trade, tariffs, anti-dumping, and countervailing duties, particularly with those two countries, but you haven't seen it as much with some of the others. And so China kind of has free reign in the global fertilizer market to maneuver in ways that will have significant knock-on effects inside the U.S. fertilizer supply chain for our farmers. The Peru especially has continued to grow as a source for food, feed, and fertilizer ingredients coming out of South America. But now with China opening the port of Chancay there, kind of becoming a megaport operation operated by Costco, China Overseas Shipping Corporation. Now you're starting to see that Peru has historically been kind of in the U.S. sphere of influence. It's now vulnerable because of China's ability to maneuver through proxies. Moving to commodities, the United States used to be, by a long shot, the highest supplier of soybeans, which is a critical food and feed ingredient in China. Brazil now sources double what the U.S. does into China. About 50% of the U.S. soybean exports still are to China, both food and feed grade. So this is why the Panama Canal and South Africa are such timely issues in the kind of the great global game, because going through the Panama Canal or going around the Cape of Good Hope at South Africa are two of the primary paths to market out of Brazil and out of South America to China. So friendly Chinese operations in those locations makes that transit a lot easier, harder for the U.S. to be able to detect, mitigate, and disrupt threats. Corn used to be a huge chunk of China's import base of corn. They're the largest corn importer in the world, but that has dwindled as they've begun to steal United States technology. In the case of Syngenta, a very massive, lengthy story. But in 2014, they began a targeted attack on Syngenta. They were able to tank its stock value and acquire Syngenta at about 40% of what its market cap should have been from a Swiss-American owned Syngenta, and then folded it in under Sinochem. And so now China suddenly went from no indigenous R&D in agriculture and biotech, in the row crop domain, to one of the largest players in the world because of that acquisition. And they continue to operate in the United States under the Syngenta U.S. name, but it is not U.S. owned. It is not Swiss owned anymore. It's now completely Chinese owned, which is why you saw Governor Huckabee Sanders in Arkansas ban any production by Syngenta in the state, specifically because of the China threat. So you have all of these little things, but seafood is really where, fish and seafood is really where you see the dynamics show up. And this is one where the DoD and the United States government gets caught directly in the wash. There was a study that was done by the Outlaw Ocean Project, a fantastic group of people there, and supported by the U.S. government, to understand the U.S.'s involvement or vulnerabilities to China's growing belligerence in global fisheries and in seafood production. And what that survey found from 21 to 22 is that $50 million worth of salmon products were acquired by the United States government and put into our food and feed supply chains. You have a massive amount of sourcing operations, thousands of tons of products and co-products that were produced with forced labor in China that came off of Chinese vessels, where forced labor happens with the fishermen, and then run through Xinjiang and other provinces where forced labor is known to be a massive part of the labor supply chain. And those products are ending up on the shelves at Walmart, Costco, Cisco, a major food supply chain company for U.S. institutions, schools, churches, entities like that, as well as at Kroger and Albertsons. $20 million worth of fish sticks that were produced and bought by the U.S. government for school lunch programs were produced by forced labor in China. 140 million in mixed fish products were going into the commissaries and cafeterias on military bases in the United States and around the world. Just really alarming, but it shows that if you don't know what you're looking at, you don't know how to dig into the details at a bill of lading level, at a commercial invoice level, and you don't have the ability to see what's happening inside the supply chain, it's very easy to interject these threats and get disruptive. Last point is that you have two major companies. Smithfield, 26% of U.S. pork production has been owned by China since the early 2010s. Syngenta I brought up, but then OBI Seafoods is known to actively source its components from Chinese supply chains, as well as those that are using forced labor. So we take all of this together and we see that it's not just the production, it's not just trade, it's packaging, it's the energy, it's the chemicals, it's the fertilizer, it's everything that goes into the production of food has massive exposure and vulnerabilities, not only to the Department of Defense here in the US, but to the entire American population.
That was fabulous. Thank you, as always, Ross. Your comprehensiveness in addressing these myriad challenges is really spectacular and a major contribution to the program. So thank you for joining us. We're going to hear next from a woman who helped expose this problem of supply chain dependency with a path-breaking book entitled China RX, which talks about the dangers of America's reliance on the Chinese for medicine in particular. I had a chance to catch up with Rosemary for our television program, Securing America, earlier in the day. She was unable to join us in person at this hour, but she was kind enough to do a video that draws upon both the insights that are contained in her book and the really important work she's been doing since with among others, government agencies, notably, as she'll talk about in this clip from her interview with me, the Defense Department. And it's vital, not only because I think what she's shown us is what we have to be doing to better understand the magnitude of our problem, but also to begin taking steps to correct it. Should have begun those long ago, but this is a moment, for reasons that have been made clear by our previous speakers. We cannot afford further delay. Let's go to the video with Rosemary Gibson, the author of China RX.
I think that our medicines and our dependence on China for them is a great kitchen table issue. It's a level setter. An average person who may not understand all of the national security issues and so forth with our industrial base and our defense industrial base and chips and so forth, by looking at this through the lens of the medicines that we rely on, including basic antibiotics that we can no longer make in the United States, that this really brings home a critical issue for our national security and also our public health. So you asked, how did I get into this? Back in 2014, I was looking for another book to write, and I came across testimony at the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission about the concerns that U.S. Americans buy a lot of supplements from China. And it was a very compelling testimony from a leader at Consumer Reports magazine. So that prompted me to start looking, well, what about our regular prescription medicines? And I just want to make sure everybody knows that these are the medicines in our legal supply chain. These are not counterfeits. These are not things that you just buy on the internet. But what we'll be talking about today are the medicines that hospitals give to their patients, that if you walk into a retail pharmacy, that this is the ones that you get in the legal supply chain. And what I discovered was just remarkable. And it was remarkable in part because of how dependent we are. But what was remarkable, Frank, is that nobody knew about this. That it took a private citizen, and I think your listeners should know that I did this in the public interest. I don't have any financial interest with any entity to put this out there. This was done in 2014 before there was much attention to domestic manufacturing and the need to bring it back. And so what I discovered is that the United States is tremendously dependent on China for basic medicines. If you're in a car accident on the DC Beltway and have to go to a hospital, you'll be getting medicines with, if not made in China, but with essential components made in China. In fact, we're so dependent, as is Europe, that if China shut the door, within 3 to 6 months, our hospitals would cease to function. The public health crisis would be off the charts. Now, it may not be that much of a dramatic impact if China chooses to do something else, and that is to perhaps not send us the best manufactured medicines. They could contaminate them. They could make them with very little actual medicine in them. So the opportunities for sabotage are profound. And if it's done on a small scale, start with 10%, 5 or 10% of pills, you gradually build up, and then you have a population that is very weakened, and ill health becomes much more pronounced and worse than that. So the book came out in 2018, and just on cue, 3 months later, the Food and Drug Administration had one of the largest recalls ever of common blood pressure medicines used by millions of Americans. And what the FDA announced was, and this was also true in Europe, that there were high levels of carcinogens in many of these common medicines, very high levels. And the worst company was one in China that had 200 times the acceptable limit per pill. And remember, people may take these pills at least once a day. And they had to be taken off the market. And that exposed how dependent we are, because there were tremendous shortages. There were senior officials in our U.S. government who said they had to wait several months to get their refills because of this. What was absolutely stunning is that it turns out that this had been going on for at least 4 to 6 years, and it was undetected by the Food and Drug Administration. And this is just one class of products. So this led to, it was a perfect opening, regrettably so, to begin to talk about our vulnerability from a supply. And what I'll talk about today is the quality of the medicines. And I'll talk about a testing program that the Department of Defense launched in November 2023 to test the quality and safety of these products, which I think is absolutely important. So people will say, where's the FDA? Well, the FDA has never been able to regulate manufacturing facilities in places like China and India like they do in the US. And it's gotten worse since China RX with China's anti-espionage law that poses threats to Americans who travel to China, fear of arrest, detainment. And so that has led to FDA inspectors who are federal employees not wanting to travel to China. And it's not just the United States regulators, it's regulators in Europe. So de facto, as a private citizen, what we have is unregulated products coming into the United States, millions and millions of tablets. And I'll also say, I believe that these could get to the president and to senior members of our government. We already have an executive order that President Trump signed in August 2020 with part of a solution. And that solution is to direct the Department of Defense, Department of Health and Human Services to give preference to US-based manufacturers, not just of the finished drugs, but their components, to give preference to them. And in that way, we'd be using our taxpayer dollars, not for all the waste and fraud and abuse that's coming out, but for actually something to improve, to actually strengthen our industrial base. For a government like the DoD, I believe they should be expanding their testing program. And it's my understanding, and this is public information, this testing program, Bloomberg has written about this, so this is not something that's secret. And they have offered, as I understand it, this data paid for by taxpayers. It can be used by the public. I'd like to see it be used by hospitals and retail pharmacies and the big buyers. Otherwise, they'll face legal consequences if they're knowingly selling defective products. So that's what the government could do and industry can do. The second thing I believe the federal government could do is execute the executive order that President Trump signed in August 2020, to have our federal government using this data to buy quality products for our military, for the strategic national stockpile, and even eventually for hospitals that are paid under Medicare and Medicaid with our tax dollars. And I want to say something to consumers. This can be very concerning, but where you can begin is if you buy vitamins. Some neighbors on our street said, well, Costco advertises that their vitamins are being tested by U.S. Pharmacopoeia, a nonprofit, very credible organization. And I have no doubt that their testing of vitamins to make sure they're certified, and you can see it on the bottle of some vitamins, you look for it, USP verified. Again, they're nonprofit, and they are the standard bearers for what is a quality medicine sold in the United States and quality vitamin. So that's what consumers can do.
This is an extraordinarily important contribution as well, not least because I think, as you've indicated, this is kind of the leading edge of public awareness of all of this. And we'll talk more about that in a moment in our Q&A, I think, as to what we need to do to enhance that with deliberation, but also to try to maximize appropriate pressure for corrective action. We're going to have one final contribution, again, from a very familiar guest on these programs, one of our other distinguished members of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired. Captain Fennell was a guest on our program last week, I believe, maybe earlier this week. And we simply grabbed a portion of his interview for this purpose as well, because I wanted to ask, based on the kinds of experiences that Colonel Newsham saluted Jim Fennell for having in his time in uniform, particularly as the Chief of Intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. What were the views of an operator on the implications of these sorts of vulnerabilities for the only military we have? And it was a very, I think, bracing conversation. We asked Captain Fennell specifically to talk about those vulnerabilities and whether it's conceivable that the Chinese Communist Party would exploit them. Let's go to the videotape with Captain Fennell now. It turns out that we are not only dependent on Communist China for a whole host of supply chains critical to our economy and to our standard of living, but also for our military as well. We're going to be doing a deep dive on what that looks like. The chips, the flat screens, the component parts, the minerals and the like. As a guy who follows the Chinese closely, as well as a distinguished military officer in your own right, what on earth is going on here? And what are the implications if it is allowed to persist?
Well, Frank, it's a very, very serious topic, and it involves the lives of every one of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, and Coast Guardsmen that serve in the Pacific, or maybe even serve in the Atlantic. It is a reflection of your question and your setup is a reflection of what we're seeing lay out across the rest of our whole government in the last 3 weeks with the Doge, and the fraud, the waste, the abuse, the corruption that's gone on in Washington, D.C. for far, far too long, and where people are not interested in protecting this nation. They're just interested in making deals and not paying attention to what is serious national security requirements. When I joined the Navy in 1986, we had people from the Cold War, the remnants of people, obviously people that had been in Vietnam, but, we had the mentality of people that had experienced World War II, the Korean War, the Cold War with the Soviets, and everything was serious. We questioned everything. Where is this from? What is this about? What vulnerability does it put us in? How can we protect it? Second, third, fourth order effects. We had people like Dr. Andy Marshall at the Office of Net Assessment looking at these things strategically out 30, 40, 50 years. And what's happened in the last 30, 40 years is after Andy Marshall passed and the people that represent that generation, that greatest generation, we've become lazy, we've become slovenly, we've not been serious about things, we've not understood, because as we say in our book, we don't recognize that China's a threat, and we followed people that said, no, they're not a threat. If we engage with them and talk with them, then they'll become like us and we don't have to worry. They truly didn't understand communism. They truly didn't understand the variant of Chinese communism, which has been intent upon destroying us, as I've said a couple of times in this interview. China is, the fact that we're dependent upon them for critical minerals, the chips, flat screens, just wires, our minerals that make the wires that make our planes fly, our tanks shoot rockets and artillery, everything. The fact that that's from China and that they know it's from us and that they can turn it off in a heartbeat, they could send us, it's very, very dangerous. And so part of it is you don't want to talk about it too much, but on the other hand, we have to take a 2x4 up to somebody's head and say, hey, wake up, you're killing us. And I hope that the Doge team comes in and not just looks for fraud and waste and what is spent, but also on the vulnerabilities, because we are very, very vulnerable. We have latest technology in our F-35, for instance, this aircraft that we're selling to all of our allies as well. It's all dependent upon parts of it, significant parts of it, from Chinese sources. And the fact that, what is this doing on, what parts of our nuclear submarine force is China dependent? What kind of our bomber force, our ICBM force, the missile defense force that President Trump wants to build over America? What part of that, what percentage of that will be dependent upon Chinese materials? So I think to a large extent, this administration really understands it, and with people like Dr. Navarro who are there and others with him that are trying to bring back manufacturing out of China to America or to our allies, that's where we have to go, and we have to go really hard on that. It can't be, and that's why I'm really encouraged by what we're seeing by the president in the first month, which is he's not doing the typical Washington, D.C. thing where it takes months or years to get one decision. He's making multiple decisions on an hourly basis across the government, and we can do that as it comes to the Department of Defense and what needs to be done. And it has to be, it'll put us maybe in a period of some vulnerability briefly, but that's better than being permanently at vulnerability where they can then essentially come in and slit our throat in the middle of the night and us not know it. We have to get off of the Chinese bandwagon. We have to decouple. The first places we should decouple are the critical areas of our national defense, our national medical supplies, food supplies, the things that would cause Americans to die immediately should they not get those materials from China.
Bracing words from Captain Fennell, words to live by, I think, and that's really the point of this conversation is, are we on a path that will make it more and more difficult for us to live, particularly if the Chinese do exploit the various vulnerabilities that have been enumerated in the course of the program to this point? We're going to do a quick round of questions with the three of our guests who are still with us. I wanted to start with you, Colonel Newsham. You did not explicitly speak to this issue. It was implicit in what you said, but I'd be anxious to get your further thoughts in terms of, basically Captain Fennell's call to decouple. There is something that Chinese call elite capture. Many of the programs in this webinar series have addressed aspects of it. But what you described from your own firsthand experience in Motorola, among other businesses out there, is the extent to which U.S. personnel, whether they're government employees in some cases, whether they're business leaders, whether they're financial mavens on Wall Street, legislators, media, Hollywood even, academics not least, we've seen this sort of capturing, to use the Chinese term, that is contributing to this threat deflation, I think is one of the terms that Brad Thayer and Captain Fennell have coined, and an effort otherwise to keep us ignorant of the inroads the Chinese have made. I talked about it in my opening remarks, the war they've been waging upon us. What are your thoughts based on your long experience with this part of the problem, not just the Chinese part, the American part of this? How do we, in fact, get business and these other influencers to eschew the Chinese to take the sorts of corrective actions, including in the industrial space, to wean us off the threats that are now much in evidence, including for the United States Armed Forces?
Well, that's a good question. If I knew the answer, I'd trademark it and retire again. What you have described really gets to the heart of things, because we talk about how the Chinese have done things to us, but it's just as true, if not more true, that we have let them do these things to us, and the Chinese have been aided and abetted by just too many of our elite class, business, financial class, the political class, and that is the key to the Chinese success. It's not that they came up with something that nobody could figure out. It's just nobody stopped them. And this is something that we have to remind ourselves of, that ultimately we've allowed this to happen. You ask yourself, well, look, all of the things that we've heard today, most of these were very well known by the early 2010s. They're widely reported. You say, well, why didn't anyone do anything? And well, Wall Street, the financial class, well, they make money from the deals. How about Capitol Hill? That's where our representatives are. Certainly, they understood the problem. They have huge staffs, and they should have stopped it. Well, you saw Capitol Hill did nothing. There were people who knew it, were very angry about it, but for some reason they could not take the necessary steps. And you look at just how hard it is now to get this to happen, for them to do anything that actually gets us off of this suicidal dependence on the Chinese. What do you do about it? I must say, I don't really know. I know that it has to we have to make it so that the cost of continuing with this is personally damaging to the people who let it happen. Either they get sued, go to jail, lose re-election, which seems to be a huge terror to many of them. But you have to get some sort of public awareness of the seriousness of the problem. We just don't have this yet. There's been some very good work being done at the state levels to educate people. But I'd say until there's this public awareness of it and some pressure actually put on the business, financial class, our politicians, and the donor class, which has such influence over Capitol Hill, that we're just going to muddle along. And this situation where if the Chinese want it, all they have to do is turn off the taps. And we are in huge, huge trouble. So this is a problem we had before World War II as well. So it's not exactly something new. And I don't really know what the answer is. We're seeing a gradual waking up, but it's not anywhere near where it needs to be. But once it becomes really a threat to people's livelihoods, then you start to see some change. And this does require some real awareness and some pressure applied, and some decent leadership as well. We could do a lot with if from the very top there is some leadership on this. But other than that, I'm not exactly sure how we're going to get out of this fix, but it is as serious as you can imagine.
Let me just offer a couple of thoughts here, if I can, and get David and Ross to react to them. One of the things that is uppermost in my mind, certainly coming out of this conversation, is it's not just our livelihoods, it's our lives, in point of fact. And I think that does, as Rosemary suggested in her comments, have a salutary effect once people start taking that aboard. In terms of progress being made, particularly with respect to those who do periodically seek re-election, a remarkable journalist, in fact, I think certainly the preeminent financial journalist of our time, Maria Bartiromo, has just completed the second of two specials that she has done. I think it's fair to say with considerable help from a great friend of our Committee on the Present Danger of China, Roger Robinson, and others, entitled Underwriting the Enemy. And this second series focused intensively on the thoughts of members of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, including its chairman and ranking member and other members on both sides of the aisle. In fact, probably more Democrats speaking about the dangers, particularly of our underwriting the Chinese Communist Party. That's one aspect of what I was just talking about with Colonel Newsham. It's only one aspect, but it's an important one that enables an awful lot of the rest of these problems. Another thought that I always feel constrained to mention in the course of these conversations when we talk about what do we do about the captured elite. Our colleague Trevor Loudon, another very influential member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China, and a participant in a wonderful roadshow that our colleague Karen Sigeman organized, taking word of what's going on here. We call it World War Xi, to the American people in 5 swing states in the course of the run-up to the fall election last year. And Trevor has pointed out that one of the techniques, if you properly understand what we're up against with the Chinese Communist Party, it really is the largest transnational criminal organization in the world, certainly the most dangerous. Techniques he recommends be used to counter that are right out of the law enforcement playbook, specifically RICO, the statutes and the penalties and so on. This meaning that, among other things, you can turn members of a kind of mafia against one another by providing asylum or witness protection or other benefits if they turn state's evidence against their colleagues. And this could be a powerful inducement, to your point, Colonel, about affecting people's livelihoods, making it personal. If it were applied in this case, I very strongly recommend that President Trump, who is providing a lot of leadership, thanks be to God, on many fronts at the moment, take this to heart and act upon it if we can. I did want to ask David any comments you might have on that, but also on something that, goes to the heart of this Trump presidency, calls it the common sense revolution. It does seem as though one of the places where common sense has simply been abandoned is the idea that there should be reciprocity with respect to the Chinese Communist Party on any of these things. We should be no more dependent on them than they are on us. We should be no more providing access to farmland or open source intelligence services or anything else than they do with us. This seems to have been dispensed with along the trail, and I wonder if you agree that it ought to be a starting point. It may be that even if they were to allow us to do certain things, we wouldn't want to do them here, but certainly this kind of disequilibrium seems to me to be something that needs to be rectified. Your thoughts, sir?
I have a couple thoughts. One specific to the Defense Department and funding some of the dual use technology that's out there. Adversarial capital is a huge issue within the kind of innovation space at the Pentagon, and that's done. China will take a couple $1 billion and spread it out over 50,000, 100,000, $1 million increments, and some startup dual use companies. And once they get to the stage where they want to do government contracting, the Pentagon will do their due diligence and figure out that they've taken Chinese money and neutralize that technology. So we're getting better. We're getting movement in that space, but it's going to take, like you said, it's going to take the private sector to really get smart about this. And I think about Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, that said, essentially, we're going to do business in China until the government tells us not to. And so it's going to take that leadership from the top. And one other thing that we're looking at very closely that I think will blow this wide open is the cartels are now foreign terrorist organizations. Which allows DoD, Treasury, many other organizations to take a look at banks and force them to comply with anti-money laundering and fraud laws. We're going to find a lot of Chinese money that's being smuggled through cartels with the fentanyl flavor, the fentanyl use case. We just did a use case yesterday using just open source, publicly available information. We tracked fentanyl from Chinese labs to the cartels through Mexico, up to the southern border, all the way to the dealer. So this is a precursor to pockets scenario using just publicly available information, a little bit of dark web forums, but it's a double-edged sword because they have to market their wares. And this is something that we can elevate and illuminate very easily.
Are you suggesting that we ought to characterize the Chinese Communist Party as an international terrorist organization as well?
Sure. Transnational terrorist organization. Just similar to Iran.
Well, this is really interesting, bringing additional law enforcement capabilities to bear. If we're not doing it just for national security reasons, that's maybe another way to skin the cat, as they say. Ross, I wanted to get your thoughts on all of this, if I can. You have also, as you noted in your remarks, been warning about particularly this problem of adulterated products, something Rosemary spoke of too. It's bad enough that we're relying on supply chains that may simply not serve up what we need when we need it, whether it's medicines or military parts. But it's also the distinct prospect that they're designed to fail or to poison or to otherwise harm us. And we've essentially created a weapons delivery vehicle by virtue of these kinds of dependencies. Would you talk a little bit about that in terms of what you're witnessing in some of these supply chains that you've talked about, whether it's fertilizers or acids of various kinds and the like? How serious a problem is this as you see it, sir?
It's a compellingly large problem that almost can't be understood by the regulators, the enforcers, law enforcement agencies that typically look at this, because it's interwoven so tightly throughout the supply chains that you almost have to know which particular needle in a mountain of needles you're looking for and what the indicators are. So you have to have not only an auditing mindset, but you almost have to have a bit of a criminal disruptive targeteer type mindset to be able to even say, what would I do? What could I do? And red teaming all of the US's supply chains for vulnerabilities isn't necessarily something that we have the scope or scale to do, but there are places we can start. Really, your threats kind of come in two categories. Number one is the product themselves. Number two is the delivery vehicle, either literally or metaphorically. On the animal feed side, one of the things that we were constantly worried about when I was working with a major importer of animal feed ingredients years ago was that the product itself is capable of sustaining a virus or a pathogen for up to 45 to 60 days, depending on what it may be. I don't think it's a secret to any of us that China is one of the world leaders in bioweapons research, and that sometimes these things can kind of slip containment. And the problem is that they are by design resilient, natural things that are designed to be able to propagate themselves in really dangerous ways. But then we layer on top of that additional vectors and mediums and modes of transportation. And all of a sudden, we're looking at how an outbreak of African swine fever in China, because of the way in which they processed animal waste, it gets into the main water supply, and then it gets fed or given back to the animals locally. That's how here in the United States, our outbreaks tend to be kind of small for African swine fever, if and when we get it. But it's the preoccupying paranoia of the animal feed industry or of the pork industry that virus could get its way into the U.S. because it can survive in a dry, dark environment for 45 to 60 days. And that's well within the window of time it would take for the pathogen to get into something in China, be brought into the U.S., and then go through the processing and mixing and blending process and be fed to an animal. And now you have an outbreak here. And the reason it's such a risk is you don't just kill the animal or cull the animal that has identifiable traits of ASF. You have to cull the entire barn or maybe the entire feed operation, which could have 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 head of hogs. It's the same for avian flu, where the vectors are even worse because you can see it get into a duck population in the wild, and then they go and they co-locate in some area with a poultry feed operation. Now you have to cull millions of birds, which is one of the big reasons we're seeing egg prices jump so much as an outbreak of avian flu. So you take all of that, that's one way, is the natural vectors or really first order way. But the second way is the logistics supply chain itself. Temu and Shine are among the largest drug trafficking operations in the world, specifically because they're able to put precursor ingredients or finished ingredients inside of things and then deliver them directly to a home in the United States. And if you do that with, this precursor amount to this home, this precursor amount to this home, all of a sudden now you have a very tight-knit conspiracy, which is one of the reasons that de minimis will be going away, is because it will increase oversight and law enforcement against small parcel packages coming direct from China. But you can aggregate and organize an entire drug shipping operation to make fentanyl in the US by sending all the precursors inside packages from Temu and Shine. And that is a known thing, naming those two particular companies as being threats of that. So it's not just how does it move as a natural pathogen, but also how can a human intervene and move it within the logistics and supply chain flow from a country of origin to the United States and introduce the threats that way. And you just see this time and time again at scale, and it requires a huge amount of expertise and oversight to be able to begin to push back against that.
Indeed, it does. But it starts with situational awareness that we got a problem. And then obviously the steps that need to be taken have to be made as clear as possible. And this is really where I think the participants in this program come in. We've got a lot of expertise and obviously in some cases, people actually directly working with the Defense Department or other agencies to try to make sure that that expertise is actually operationalized. And I think we've had a very important, if small, sample of it here today, and I'm grateful to each of you for contributing to our situational awareness and hopefully thereby to that of the larger public, our leaders, and those in the agencies that are directly responsible. I did want to just finish on this thought, something that I think Rosemary talked about. I know she did on our program. I can't remember if it made the cut in the edited version, but she talked about how the Food and Drug Administration, which we count on to do inspections and quality control on drugs, is now sufficiently concerned about the safety of its inspectors going into communist China in light of various laws that are on the books there now, including an anti-espionage law that can be used at will against such people. That essentially this is now an unregulated commercial operation, bringing stuff into our country, and whether it's by the mail or whether it's in the shipping containers, it's pretty clear it's not being adequately scrutinized. And why I think the testing program that Rosemary talked about, that the DoD is doing, with a specific view, as she's mentioned, I think, to 40 battlefield medications, literally probably life and death for some of our men and women in uniform if we wind up in a shooting war, that are in some cases generic drugs that are not properly providing the medical benefits that they're supposed to, and God forbid that may actually be designed to compound the dangers, as I think you pointed out, David, in some of the medical kit that you were talking about as well. It is hard to overstate how important this particular facet of China's unrestricted warfare is against us, how urgent it is that we get our hands around it. I'm very heartened personally that Dr. Peter Navarro, a great friend of ours and a lifelong critic of communist China, is back in the White House working on the manufacturing operations of our country to try to rectify some of the problems we've talked about. We invited him to participate in this program. I think the rest of other business was on keeping him from doing so. I hope we will in the future. But to all of you who have presented, Grant Newsham, David Cook, Ross Kennedy, Rosemary Gibson, and Jim Fennell, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And I hope providing really the most vigorous of wake-up calls to all who will listen to this program, those of you actively participating in our Q&A and listening to it live, and those who will be listening to it in the future. Please pass this on. It is absolutely vital that those in positions of responsibility able to help correct the sorts of problems we've talked about here get cracking on it. And I think this is a window of opportunity in which that can and must be done. So again, my heartfelt thanks to all hands, especially to our audience for listening. And as always, I would admonish you to go forth and multiply. God bless you all. Dee Dee, back to you.
Thanks, Frank. A video of this webinar will be posted to presentdangerchina.org within a day or so of the conclusion of our program. It'll be at the same link where you registered. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. Moms, share to your moms' groups, and dads, share to your dads' groups. Former military, share it with your fellow soldiers. Get this up and get it out. And subscribe to our Substack at Present Danger China. Follow us on X at CPD China, and we'll get you some updates there. Join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.